Okay, so hi everyone, welcome to our AIR seminar for Monday. So I'm presenting Tao Du today. He's a final year PhD student in computer science at MIT CSAIL, advised by Professor Wojciech Matusik. His research lies at the intersection of computer graphics, robotics, and machine learning, with a broad interest in developing computational methods for solving challenging design and control problems in complex real-world physics systems. His work has been published at top-tier computer graphics and machine learning conferences, SIGGRAPH Asia, NeurIPS, ICML, and iClear, and has been covered by multiple media outlets, including Wired, IEEE Spectrum, TechCrunch, MIT News, and more. Take it away, Tao, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and let me share my screen. Okay, does it work? Okay, and okay, I guess I can start. Is my audio working as well? Great. All right. So it's my pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to talk about our recent thoughts on simulation and robotics. So the topic of my talk today is going to be about differentiable simulation methodology and its application on robotic agent designs. As we all know, robotics have very ubiquitous applications in industry and in our daily life. And here we see a few very representative designs from different robotics domains, including like the aerial robots, the underwater robots, robotic locomotion, and the manipulation tasks. And it can be seen that from all of these designs, they are very, very diverse, and they're highly dependent on the specific tasks. And the fact that these non-uniform and non-symmetric robotic designs also indicate that designing such a robot typically requires a very deep understanding of the specific task. It requires a lot of domain-specific knowledge and human expertise. And as of today, it is still a human-in-the-loop process. And it is labor-intensive and error-prone to design and build and test a robot. And failure cases do happen very commonly, as can be seen from the video here on the right. So the topic, I'm not sure if it's playing or not. Okay, anyway, so the topic of my talk today is to share our thoughts on how we can leverage computational power and build computational methods or algorithms to help people simplify this task and fully automate the design process. And our vision for robotic agent design is that hopefully in the near future, robotic designs can be fully synthesized by computers automatically. Specifically, we want to lower the entry barrier for amateur users to design their own robots by just describing their requirements verbally. And computers, once they accept the request, they will synthesize and they will leverage very powerful computational resources and computational algorithms to synthesize and discover the optimal shape and control, or the body and the brain of the robots automatically. And in today's talk, I will introduce our recent attempts towards this grand vision. And my talk consists of 3 parts. So in the first part, I will lay some foundations of the concept called computational robot design, and this is going to be an attempt that replaces the human-in-the-loop original design pipelines for robotics. And specifically, I will be answering 2 questions in this part, which are the definition or the concept of the computational design pipeline, and also more importantly, what we consider is the role of a simulation tool in this computational design pipeline. And in the second part of my talk, I will be talking about some recent development of we consider next generation differentiable simulators. And we will show that by leveraging some very interesting numerical patterns, we're able to enhance or upgrade the simulation tool in a computational design pipeline to simulate more intricate physics phenomenon with high degrees of freedom. And finally, in the third part of my talk, I will be discussing some potential applications unlocked by the new differentiable simulators. And I will be talking about a few very concrete examples, including real world robot design examples, and to show that with a more powerful and enhanced differentiable simulators, we are able to explore new opportunities in robotic agent design. Okay, so let's get started with the first part of my talk, which is foundation. And here I'm going to use one relatively old work from my early PhD career to explain the basic concept of computational robotics design, and also to highlight the role of a simulation tool. So this paper is called Computational Multi-Copter Design. It was published at ACM SIGGRAPH Asia in 2016 in collaboration with IST Austria. And in this paper, we attempted to propose a computational design pipeline for one particular type of robot, which is aerial robot. And more specifically, we're considering the task of building multi-copters, aerial robots with multiple numbers of rotors, and to fulfill some requests from tasks like carrying a payload. And we first reviewed the typical process of designing such a multi-rotor robot. And we figured that this process depends heavily on human expertise. And here is how this design task is typically implemented. So people started from proposing an initial shape design and also a controller design for their multi-rotor, which is typically based on some prior experience with standard designs like quad rotors or hexa rotors. And then once they have the initial designs, people will evaluate the performance of the robot with a simulation tool. And once the simulation tool gives a green light for the designs, engineers will start implementing or fabricating the real robot and conduct a real flight test. And then probably in the very first prototype, we will see some suboptimal designs and some discrepancy between what the simulation predicts and what people observe in the real world experiment. And then here comes the human expertise. So typically a very experienced engineer will start comparing the results and reading the flight log, for example, and trying to understand what is the source of the suboptimal performance from the design, and what could be improved, both in terms of the shape and the controller of the robot. And this essentially closes the iteration or the loop in this design process. And this loop, of course, can run for a couple of times with a few iterations of the prototypes and alternations between hardware, software, simulation, and reality until we are happy with the final converged designs, both in simulation and in reality. So what we are trying to automate, or what we're trying to improve in this process, is that we're trying to figure out whether there's a possibility for a computer to be more involved and to replace tedious iterations governed by human experts. So what we are proposing in this work is a following pipeline, which we call the computational multi-copter design pipeline. And essentially, we're trying to move or shift the work of the loop from the hand of human experts to the computers. And as can be seen from the new diagram here, we still start with a design of the body and the brain of the robot, and we also leverage a simulation tool. However, instead of conducting the real flight test and analyzing the flight log to gain some knowledge of the improvements, we choose to develop computational algorithms to analyze the performance in simulation and propose new changes to both the shape design and the controller design. So this essentially moves the iteration from the outside to the computer itself, and iterations within the computer is going to be much faster and less catastrophic, especially considering that developing flying robots or aerial robots typically involves will typically involve a catastrophic crash on the real world flight test. And more specifically, we are leveraging a so-called differentiable simulation tool at the core of our computational design pipeline. So our pipeline starts with a parameterization of the shape and controller space. And then we leverage a simulation tool we developed to compute the gradients with respect to these parameters. And then we run continuous optimization algorithms to propose new changes to both the shape and the controller. And closing this loop, we iterate multiple times until we are happy with the performance of the robot. And here we show this is a screenshot of the differentiable simulation tool we developed for this project. And if you can follow the mouse cursor is currently trying to explore the continuously parameterized design space. As you can see, if I vary the continuous parameters, I can vary the length and the orientation or the location of some of the components in the designs, including the rotors or propellers or the length of the size of the rod. And once we're happy with maybe one instance of the designs, we can use this tool to simulate the design with a meticulously calculated controller. And the simulator will not only return the performance metric of the design, but also trying to return some gradient information of the performance metric with respect to the design parameters here. And therefore, you can probably imagine that by calling gradient-based algorithms, we can improve the design along the gradient direction and improve the performance metric accordingly. And the next question is, of course, once we verify the design simulation, we're always curious to know if this is really applicable to real world designs, or how does the perform improve in the real world flight test. And here we're showing one of the examples from the paper, which is designing a pentacopter and trying to maximize its payload. And on the top left, you see a figure of an original design, which is from one of the mechanical engineers in the lab. And this is a design that essentially leverages the prior knowledge and the prior domain-specific knowledge of copters from the mechanical engineer. And the design is relatively symmetric, as you can see from the figure. There are four rotors apparently borrowed from the design of a quad rotor, and there's another front rotor which is along the symmetrical axis. And once we built this unoptimized or the initial design, we conduct a real world flight test. And here on the right, you see the video showing the copter is trying to carry a payload by taking off and traverse horizontally and landing on a pre-specified target location somewhere here, if you can follow my mouse cursor. And then we run our computational robotic design pipeline, and the pipeline returned a new design, which is at least visually looking, it's substantially different from the original design. And perhaps a few notable differences between the two designs is that for the optimized design, we see there's a drastic change in the location of the front rotors, and the whole frame becomes larger after the optimization. And as before, we also conducted a real-world flight test. Once we have the design from the computer, we build the copter and we execute the same task. And by analyzing the flight log, we can understand the source of efficiency coming from this optimized design. So, so first we reported the number of the maximum payload from both designs. And as you can see, there's apparently a statistically significant improvement in terms of the maximum payload this design can carry. And we also analyzed the flight log. Here we recorded the PWM number, which is kind of proportional to the maximum to the thrust provided by each of the propeller during the flight test. And as you can see, for the original design, there is some kind of the room of improvement for one of the rotor number 5 in the front, as it is not reaching its maximum value for the thrust. And the computer kind of understands this, and it tries to adjust the design of the geometric design of your copter. And it manages to figure out a new layout of the rotors. And once we implement these new rotors, we can observe from the log that the maximum thrust can get improved significantly for this particular rotor. And therefore, once you have all the 5 rotors at the maximum speed, you kind of expect the payload will get improved as well. So it's important to notice that this process is driven by the computational algorithm we developed, and there's no kind of the human interference in terms of giving some prior knowledge of the rotors. It's purely discovered by the computer. So just to do a brief summary of this project, as well as the first part of the talk, we're attempting to present a computational design pipeline that can kind of remove the human in the loop traditional design pipeline, at least for the every robot design. And we show that computational methods bring new tools and new opportunities to the design problem. And we are shifting from iteration by human to iteration by algorithms. And the second lesson we learned from this project is that differentiable simulation tool can play a very central role in this process. Specifically, it provides gradient information with respect to the shape parameters and the control parameters to unlock continuous optimization algorithms in terms of the exploring new body and new brain of a robot. So the next question we asked ourselves after finishing this project is that, given that we were only using a kind of a simplified rigid body simulator in this project to guide the design process of a rigid body robot, if we were able to propose more sophisticated differentiable simulator for more intricate physics phenomena like fluids or softer bodies or their couplings, is there any possibility to help the design process of more complicated robots as well? And then it comes to the second part of my talk, which is going to be about our recent development of 2 very specific differentiable simulators targeted at robotic research or robotic applications. And so before I jump into the technical details of the differentiable simulation tool we developed, I would like to do a very quick recap of what people have learned about the concept of differentiable simulation by reviewing some of the related work. Although it might be a kind of a recent concept in machine learning and graphics, differentiable simulation actually has a very long history that can be traced back to the 18th century. Here, of course, people always started with a very simplified problem and trying to understand it first. The differential simulation, the idea of deriving gradients in a differential simulation could work for a rigid body simulation, which is perhaps one of the most simplified physics system. And the answer is probably yes. And people knew this answer for a long time ago. And for this particular kind of the systems, and for example, like the classical cart pole example, or the pendulum example, or maybe some other commonly seen rigid robots, like the aerial robot we have shown before. For this kind of the system, writing down the governing equation is not a problem, and they also have relatively low degrees of freedom. So essentially, deriving their gradients is also not a very big problem. Even if you are using the possibly slowest algorithm to derive the gradients, it's probably still very affordable. And another recent trend which starts to draw people's attention is to develop differentiable simulation tools for more sophisticated physics systems. Here, I showed a few recent papers targeted at applications like deformable body simulation and cloth simulation and fluid simulation. So all of these works, they attempted to propose differentiable simulators that can provide not only evaluate the forward process, but also provide gradient information with respect to the design parameters, shape parameters, material parameters, or control parameters. And it is worth noting that deriving gradients for such a high degrees of freedom system is going to be much more interesting, mostly because they have more intricate governing equations and also requires more computational resources and computational time. And the message I'm trying to convey in this particular section of my talk is that from our experience with two recently developed differentiable simulators, we tend to think deriving gradients for such a complicated system can be not only a science, but also an art. Specifically, it can be an art of recognizing numerical patterns and choosing the numerical solvers wisely. And if you can do this wisely, and it will save you a lot of time and memory if you compare if you compare to the classical or very standard way of deriving gradients in a system like the backpropagation or the chain rule that is typically used in machine learning or in neural networks these days. So here, next, I'm going to present two case studies to show this point. So the first one is called, it's a paper called Ph.D. Differentiable projective dynamics with contact. So in this project, our goal is to develop a differentiable, robust, and fast soft body simulator for soft body research. And the motivation behind our work is that we have noticed that at least in the graphics community, people know how to speed up forward simulation process for deformable body simulation or for soft body simulation. There have been lots of SIGGRAPH papers and other graphics papers working on this topic, and they proposed lots of very useful numerical or algorithmic solutions to this problem. And the question we want to ask is that when we're trying to develop or augment such a simulator to provide differentiability, can we borrow these forward techniques to speed up backpropagation computation as well? And our answer tends to be yes. And in this paper, we're going to demonstrate this idea with one particular numerical tricks called projective dynamics developed by graphics people for speeding up the forward simulation process. And the high level idea inside this differentiable simulation is as follows. So first, we started from understanding the forward simulation process for simulating a software robot. So here we choose to start with the implicit time integration due to its numerical robustness. And simulating such a robot with implicit time integration is essentially trying to find a root of the following nonlinear system. And this is purely a numerical problem, and with a lot of very mature solvers have been developed by experts. And solving it typically requires an iterative solver that constantly linearizes the system within each time step. And this is a source of the inefficiency in the forward simulation, because as you could probably imagine, there will be lots of degrees of freedom in a softer body system. And the matrix here on the left-hand side is going to be, although it's going to be sparse, it's going to be extremely large. It could be as big as like hundreds of thousands or even millions of the elements. And linearizing that requires a lot of computational resources. And the projective dynamics trick is a very clever numerical trick that can split the matrix into, that proposes to split the matrix into a constant matrix and then easy to parallelize the residual. And then people once we have this split scheme, people proposes to use prefactorize the constant part and parallelize the residual part. And then with certain assumptions on the material properties of the software robots, people are able to observe at least a 10 times speed up from this project dynamics trick, at least for forward simulation. So we have shown that in the paper that the same idea that can be used to speed up forward simulation can also be used to speed up back propagation. And to show this point, we prepared a few benchmark tests as well as some downstream applications. So the first one here is a very standard test called the cantilever beam, with one end fixed on the wall, and the other end is kind of free. And we initially twisted the cantilever beam, and then we set it free, and the beam starts to resumes to its original rest shape, of course, under the influence of gravity. And we compared the time spent on this example, including both forward simulation and back propagation. Here, back propagation is calculating the gradients from gradients of a fictitious loss function defined on the positional and the velocity information of the cantilever beam. And we have noticed that within the project dynamics trick and within the augmentation to the back propagation, we're able to maintain the roughly 10 times speed up from forward simulation, and we can maintain this kind of the speed up in back propagation as well. So this brings up a lot of very exciting applications, and we can show that with this new differentiable simulation tool, we're able to speed up all of these applications significantly. So the first one, which is also a very standard task in robotics, is called trajectory optimization. And here we're considering a torus-like terrestrial robot, and the robot is actuated with 8 pairs of the muscles, not shown here, but you can. Let's just imagine there are muscles along this inside each of the sectors, and the muscles can contract or expand. And within by leveraging the friction between the torus and the ground, and by properly programming the control signals sent to the muscles inside the torus is actually capable of moving forward by rolling itself in a clockwise direction. And here we reported the time cost by solving this problem with our Diff.Pd tool and with 2 very standard Newton's method solvers. And we can observe there's a substantial speed up that we can gain from this new tool. And another example we demonstrated in the paper is a closed loop neural network controller. And here we are considering the task of actuating a soft underwater robot. And again, there are a pair of the muscle fibers along the spine direction of the fish. And the goal is to come up with a neural network, closed loop neural network controller that can let the fish swim forward as fast as possible. And here we are not only comparing our Diff.Pd simulator to the Newton's method as before, but also we're comparing it to some other very standard and state-of-the-art gradient-free algorithms, aka the reinforcement learning algorithms in our case, and we observed that there's a substantial speed up once we leverage the powerful gradient calculation in Diff.Ph.D. So to summarize briefly, this paper has shown to us that if you can recognize the numerical patterns from the numerical problem you try to solve in simulation, there's a chance of speeding up the backpropagation process, and there's a good chance that you can use the carefully calculated gradients to facilitate the downstream applications. And in the next project, we will show a similar story, but in a different problem domain. And in this paper called Functional Optimization of Fluidic Devices with Differentiable Stokes Flow, we are going to present a differentiable fluidic simulator that can be very beneficial for mechanical engineers to design fluidic devices. And again, in this paper, we will share the story of identifying the interesting numerical patterns in the governing equations and show how we can leverage this these interesting numerical patterns to speed up the computational process of backpropagation or gradients. So just as in the previous project, we also started from understanding the governing equation first. So in this project, we are considering simulating the Stokes flow, which can be very well characterized by the two partial derivative equations here. And one thing we have noticed or we have learned from the prior art is that there's a very strong analogy between the governing equations of the Stokes flow and the governing equations of linear elasticity in soft body or deformable body simulation. And by leveraging this analogy, deriving the gradients use a linear elasticity system can lead to a simplified computation. And this is the main information we attempt to convey in this project. And once we developed such a simplified version of the gradient computation, we can speed up the calculation, we can save some time, and we can also show that with such a additional gradient information, it can also help us explore the design process of for fluidic devices. And here we show one of the examples from the paper, which is called a fluidic twister. And the task of this design problem is that we have this vertically flowing water from with the inlet on the top and the outlet at the bottom. And there's a surface which is a yellow area, and the surface is a parametric. It's a parametric surface to be optimized. And the goal of this design task is to come up with a fluidic twister such that we can observe a non-zero curl at the bottom of the pipe by parameterizing or by carefully updating the surface shape of the pipe. And again, we run we calculate the gradients from the simulator, and then we run gradient-based algorithms by formulating a loss function defined at the curl of the outlet fluid field, velocity field. And after a few iterations of gradient descent, we observed a very interesting twisted or helical surface as desired emerging from this problem. And again, this is automatically discovered by the computational algorithm without any human interference. Just to so to summarize this part of the talk, we're trying to show that deriving a differentiable simulator can be, of course, it can be just applying the chain rule and doing backpropagation. However, for more sophisticated physical systems, we want to tell people that such a process can be more than just applying the chain rule. Specifically, there's a good chance that we can improve the computational efficiency by carefully and creatively identifying the numerical patterns and by leveraging some carefully designed numerical tools. Okay, so now that we have shown that we're able to develop new differentiable simulators for not only the rigid body robots, but also for more intricate robots like software robots or underwater robots. The next topic of my talk is going to be what are the new opportunities or what are the new possibilities that are unlocked by using these different newly developed differentiable simulators in robotic agent designs. So here I will be talking about a few possible applications enabled by after we have these new differentiable simulation tools. So as a recap, here is the original computational robot design pipeline from the first copter paper covered in this talk. And we can see that simulation plays a central role in this computational pipeline. It connects the input from shape design and controller design, and it also provides a benchmark result to be compared with a real world experiment. So by looking at this figure, we can identify at least 3 possible directions that a differentiable simulator as well as its gradients can help in this whole design process. So the first part is called the shape optimization part, which is also briefly touched in the copter project. Essentially, once we are able to calculate the gradients, we can direct the gradient with respect to the shape parameters and use this to improve the shape designs. And the second possibility is to connect the differentiable simulator to controller design, which is also briefly described in the Ph.D. paper. Given that we are able to calculate gradients with respect to the control parameters, we of course are able to run gradient-based algorithms and improve the controller design as well. And the third direction, which is I kind of think more interesting and more practical for real-world robot designs, is to use the gradient information from the differentiable simulator to narrow the sim-to-real gap or the reality gap between what the simulation predicts and what the real-world experiment observes. So next, I'll briefly talk about the three directions, and in the interest of time, I will be focusing on just one project in this part. So the first part regarding using gradients information to improve the shape design. This can be seen from one of our a recent paper from our lab which is called Differentiable. So this is in this paper we're using the Ph.D. simulator we described to explore the design space of marine creatures, which has a lot of different morphology and variations in its topology. And the idea is to propose a carefully parameterized design space for all of these different marine creatures. And by calculating the gradients with respect to the design parameters, we're able to explore a very rich and diverse design space of the marine creatures, as can be seen from the triangular shape here. We're able to do some very cool applications like finding the optimal morphology in terms of maximizing the speed of the marine creature or making it gust resistant. And in terms of the leveraging gradient information to facilitate the controller design, I'm presenting this recent iClear paper called Plasticine Lab. And in this work, we are again developing a differentiable simulator for soft body manipulation tasks. And in this paper, we showed that by leveraging the gradient information, we're able to quickly fine-tune an open loop controller that can outperform a state-of-the-art reinforcement learning-based controller by a large margin. And finally, regarding the using the gradient information to narrow the sim-to-real gap, I will talk about in detail this, again, also a very recent work conditionally accepted to IEEE RAW. The work is about designing an iterative algorithm framework to control and to control a soft starfish and also building a dynamic model of the for the underlying physics system. And the motivation of this work is that we observed that in the soft underwater robot research, people are still relying very heavily on human expertise to come up with both the design of the underwater robot as well as a controller. So in this work, we are making our first attempt to incorporating as much as possible computational power or computational algorithms to automate and simplify this process. And specifically, we are considering this horizontally moving starfish instance. And this is a customly built soft underwater robot in our lab. And the goal is to come up with a very good controller that can move the starfish forward along the horizontal direction from right to its left as fast as possible. And this brings in a few very challenging problems. So the first one is that when we're trying to solve this problem, we're trying to solve actually two sub-problems at the same time. So the system has unknown parameters, not only from the soft robot itself, but also from the fluid solid interaction or from the hydrodynamic model. And the second sub-problem is that we are also trying to solve the unknown motion. Although this is actually what we really care about, but solving the unknown motion is deeply coupled with solving or identifying the dynamic model for the robotic system. And our idea in this paper is to leverage the differentiable simulation and specifically leverage the gradient information from a differentiable simulator to iteratively calibrate the system and optimize the motion. So we are alternating between solving the system and solving the motion. And eventually, our goal is to come up with a kind of an accurate underlying dynamic model of the robot, as well as trying to propose an optimal controller that could be used both in simulation and in the real life experiment. So more specifically, this diagram shows the whole shows one particular iteration of the whole algorithm. At the core of this algorithm is the sim-real alternation scheme. So we start from the real world experiment, and we obtain a control signal from our computer. Initially, this was initialized with a random or an educated guess of the control signal. But later in the iterations, this will be replaced by the optimal control signal predicted by the simulator. And once we obtain the control information, we execute the control signal in the real world experimental setup, and we gather more real world experimental data. And this data is then fed back into the differentiable simulation tool. And we use this to formulate an optimization problem. And specifically, we are trying to narrow down the discrepancy between the simulated motion and the observed motion. And by running the gradient descent algorithm, we're able to identify the material parameters as well as the hydrodynamic parameters from the soft starfish. And finally, once we have the calibrated model of the soft starfish as well as the calibrated hydrodynamic effects, we can again use the gradient information from the simulator to improve the open loop control signal, and in simulation we can observe the improvements by optimizing the control sequence, and this sequence will be then returned by the algorithm and closing this sim-real alternation and starting the next iteration. So does this sim-real alternation pipeline really work? Our observation is that we tend to believe this is a very good solution to such a specific problem. And here we show the results for the 4 iterations from the initial most educated guess of the control signal. And the algorithm converges after 4 iterations, so we do not conduct further experiments. And as can be seen, once the video is finished playing, is that we do observe two things. So first thing is that with this iterative scheme, we can see the performance is indeed gets improved from iteration to iteration. And specifically, the most critical performance metric we care about is how long the distance that the center of mass of the starfish can traverse. And the answer is that we do observe a 4x longer distance traveled by the starfish, indicating that we are indeed doing something right to actuate the softer starfish from the algorithm. And the second question we want to answer, which is equally important, is that whether the calibrated dynamic model after all of these iterations can indeed do a very good job of matching the simulation to the reality. And to show this here, we present the log of the center of mass of the starfish from both the simulated work and the real world experiment. And as we can see from this picture, is that although there are still indeed discrepancies between the two motion sequences, there are two notable or promising results from this figure. So the first one is that we do observe there are very similar horizontal offset, indicating that they are traveling along roughly the same amount of distance in simulation and in reality. And the second promising information is that we noticed although there are discrepancies between the simulated motion and the real world motion, we do observe there are very similar cyclical motion patterns as highlighted by the two red blocks here that we can observe both from the simulated starfish and the real starfish. I see there's a message here.
Yeah, so let me ask a question from Basil, if you're willing to
Sure.
answer it right now. So he's saying, how many samples does it take before the simulation matches well enough reality in this case?
Yeah. So in terms of the samples, I'm not sure whether we have the same definition of the sample, but let me just explain how much data we need when conducting this experiment. Let's see if I can. So for the real world experiment, we captured about 30 seconds of the motion sequence from the experiment, and we are using about 30% of the motion sequence to train, or maybe it's not accurate to call the training algorithm, but to optimize the system identification and trajectory optimization. So in terms of the concrete number of the samples, we are using the 30 seconds times 30%, that is 9 seconds of the video clips at 30 FPS. So that's about less than 300 frames of the information. Okay, so let's move on. Actually, I think I'm about to close this talk. So just to summarize what we have learned from the third part of this talk, we showed in a few potential applications that differentiable simulation, especially once it is equipped with more sophisticated physical phenomena, it can be a very powerful tool in robotic designs. It can unlock the usage of gradient-based algorithms in lots of very standard and common robotics tasks, like exploring the design space and optimizing the controllers, doing system identification, and narrowing the sim to real gap. Okay, so I will use maybe the next few minutes to conclude the talk. And just to do a recap of the outline of the talk. So here I started from describing a computational design pipeline and highlights the role of a simulation tool. And then I described our recent development of two differentiable simulators and showing that they could be used for robotic agent designs for real world applications. And if I were to summarize the lessons we learned from this journey of exploring differentiable simulator and its application in robotic designs, I would like to summarize them in 2 slides. So the first lesson we learned, and we have been keeping learning from multiple projects in our lab, is that designing robots is still a very tedious and error-prone progress these days. And failure cases do happen very commonly. And our vision is that hopefully in the near future, computational methods can fully automate this process and lower the entry barrier for amateur users to design their own robots. And so the second lesson that we have learned from this journey is that differentiable simulation can be a very powerful tool, and developing the gradients for this differentiable simulation tools can be both a science and an art of recognizing the numerical patterns. And more importantly, once we are able to have this gradient information from this tool, we're able to unlock gradient-based methods in many real-world robotic design problems and applications. Okay, so this concludes my talk. I would love to thank my collaborators covered in, for the papers covered in this talk, and also for their images and videos. And thank you everyone for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Tao, for the great presentation. This is all super interesting. So yeah, we'll move on to questions. So if anyone has a question, you can, I think you can unmute yourselves. I think you have permission to do that, and then you can just ask away.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, I have one question, but it's a little bit kind of different from the general line of the talk. Is I'm not very familiar with this kind of research in the robotic space, but are you use a lot, you use differentiability in order to train these algorithms faster to converge onto like a design, right? Are there any like very famous examples of simulators that are non-differentiable, and is this like still the standard of simulators, and how do you deal with that kind of obstacle when you have like non-differentiable simulators?
Yeah, this is a great question, and so I think the answer is kind of complicated. So first, for simulation, there are differentiable simulation is kind of a recent concept in graphics and in machine learning. Although I would like to argue that it is just a rediscovery of some very old concepts. So for most of the existing simulation tools or off-the-shelf simulation tools, many of them did not support differentiability originally, but we have also observed that more and more simulation tools start to implement gradients and start to provide gradient information for downstream applications. And in terms of the robotic design tasks, I think many of the classical examples in robotics are focused on rigid robot designs, like rigid humanoid robots, or like the rigid aerial robots. And for these kind of the tasks, people, as I briefly stated in the talk, that although people did not use the terminology differentiable simulation explicitly, people might be unintentionally using this concept in designing rigid robots, primarily for the controller designs. But for the shape designs, this is less explored. Mm-hmm. And for softer robot designs, this is more recent. And I think this field or this subfield is still evolving very, very fast. And I think nothing is fully settled in terms of both what will be the most proper simulation tool, or what will be the most proper control algorithm. So this is still under exploration.
Great, thank you. I have like kind of a follow-up to that. So do you think in some cases, basically making a differentiable simulator is very time consuming and requires a lot of like brain power and a lot of, coding power in some sense? do you think this might be more effortful than exploring algorithms for non-differentiable simulators? So yeah, because it's easier just to build a good simulator that has good properties for whatever you want, and there's not differentiable, and then maybe just the time that you saved on that you can just waste on the black box optimization procedures.
Yeah, that's another very great question. And my understanding is that I think these days people are trying to collaborate with each other, and it is definitely true that developing a differentiable simulator requires lots of expertise and it requires lots of the coding skills. So I think it's more like graphics people tend to do this work, and they try to equip the state-of-the-art simulator with gradients and try to provide this. Basically, we try to build up the infrastructure for other people to use, and robotics people and machine learning people can treat themselves as end users, and they can focus on developing learning algorithms or control algorithms on top of that. And it is definitely going to be very challenging, as you mentioned, that for one person to do both of the work here.
Okay, great. Well, thanks you so much. Yeah, those are really good answers to the questions.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for attending. Yep, and see you again next week.